Hey, it's Steve. Well, I've wrapped up the construction of yet another N-scale micro layout. This highly detailed layout is 17 by 30 inches, features continuous running, and also multiple industries to switch. This is a great layout for a side table or even a large desk, and shows you can have a fun layout even in a very small space. The controller I'm using allows you to run the layout by either battery power or AC wall power, allowing you to operate it anywhere, even on an outdoor patio table like you see here. Anyway, let's jump into how I built this great little layout. But before we do, take a second to smash that like button because it really does help out the channel quite a bit. Thanks. Alright, anyway, so I started out with a 16 by 28 inch pine board that I picked up from Home Depot, and I framed that up with some 1/2 inch by 4 inch poplar to produce a sturdy base for the layout. I also screwed and glued some extra pieces of poplar on the bottom of the layout base to help kind of prevent the layout base from warping and to allow a recessed space for some wires as well later on. Once I had everything glued and nailed together, I cut a piece of 2-inch thick insulation board to fit in the opening and then simply glued that in place with some wood glue. In the past, I've used construction adhesive for foam board, but now I just prefer to use regular wood glue since I find that it secures the foam very well. It doesn't eat away at the foam at all, and it's just easy to use. So next it was time to figure out my track plan. You can see what I came up with here. I used Kato Unitrack for the loop, which has 7.5 inch radius curves. I'm using a number 6 turnout as well as a 6-inch radius turnout that works with the Kato compact track sets. While it is an extremely tight curve, the 6-inch radius turnout actually seems to be more reliable and works better than the Kato number 4 turnouts, which just everything seems to derail on those unless you take a lot of care to kind of file the points and everything. And so the 6-inch radius turnout just works really well, and there wasn't actually room to do 2 number 6 turnouts back to back given the space that I had. I used a power lead on each of the sidings plus the main loop, and I drilled a hole in the location for each of the power leads as well as where the turnout control wires came out. I decided not to actually wire up the turnout control since the layout is so small, and later just tuck the wires up into a hole in the base of the layout. It's really just easier to use the built-in turnout throw switches on the layout that's this small since everything is very well within reach. And then to make sure I had good electrical connectivity everywhere, I did solder most of the rail joints. I did leave a couple unsoldered just to allow for some expansion, but for the most part I did solder most of the rail joints. Since I'm not fantastic at soldering, I did have to file some of the solder joints down to make sure the track was smooth, and after some test runs showed everything was working well, it was time to move on to the scenery. To make the layout more visually interesting, I wanted to have a second level for some of the structures and to provide a way to hide part of the track loop. I cut a curved piece of foam for a roadway to connect the upper and lower levels and glued and screwed that foam into place. I wanted concrete retaining walls along the edge of the roadways as well as 2 of the sides of the upper level. And so to make those, I just simply cut some chipboard to size and glued that in place and then used some waste to kind of hold everything in place while the glue was drying. Later on I would come back and paint this and weather everything to look a little bit more like concrete. Once that was all dry, I mixed up a couple small batches of sculpted mold and filled in all the gaps around the upper level and also covered over all the screw holes. While that was drying, I started going through all of my structure kits to figure out how I was going to arrange and build the structures on this layout. Most of the kits actually came from the Woodland Scenics Town and Industry building set that is designed to work with their 3x6 foot N-scale layout kit they offer. It's really a great value because you get a lot of structures, you get a bunch of detail parts in a bag, and it's all a lot less than buying each of those structures individually. I did also pick up a couple of additional structure kits as well to use with this layout, and I'll try to have links to some of those below in the description. I did try different arrangements of structure pieces and then kind of decided to just scratch build a larger corner structure that would be placed over the track in that area. I mocked up the structure with chipboard and then actually later used that for the structure itself, and then taped together the various building kit pieces to kind of figure out how I wanted to arrange everything on the layout. I eventually decided on a different arrangement of the buildings, but you can see here what my first crack at the building placement looked like. Since the corner structure was the largest, I started working on that one first. I cut some thin sheet styrene to place over the chipboard, glued that on, then glued the wall pieces together using some 1/4-inch wood strips in the corners for support. I cut some strips of styrene off of a larger sheet to help simulate panel lines on the structure and glued all those onto 2 of the sides of the structure. Now apparently, my iPhone became too bored watching me do all this and decided to fall off the tripod straight into the garbage can, so that was nice. But after rescuing the iPhone, I did keep gluing on the styrene strips vertically and also glued a horizontal band onto the top of the structure. To help add rigidity to the whole structure, I cut a piece of 1-inch thick insulation foam board to kind of fit inside the top of the structure, and that also served as the structure's roof. I didn't record the next steps apparently, but I did glue random bits of things from my scrap box onto the top of the roof to kind of give the appearance of windows and vents and things, and then I glued a layer of ballast to simulate a gravel roof on top of the foam. And then I spray painted the entire structure with a gray primer, and then for the final finish I used a stone gray spray paint and painted the 2 sides of the structure that face inward towards the layout. I didn't worry about making the bottom half of the long side look that great since it was going to be covered up by the upper level portion of the layout and wasn't going to be visible anyway. I also assembled some of the structure kit pieces to serve as a brick portion of the large corner structure and sprayed that as well with the gray primer. For the final brick color, I sprayed the building a rusty metal primer from Rust-Oleum, which I think makes a nice brick color. I also wanted the corner structure to have a concrete floor, and so I added some layers of chipboard and then some sheet styrene to serve as a concrete floor, which was sprayed a light gray color. I figured out my final structure placement and assembled those structures so I could paint those as well. These were all painted with the gray primer first, and then I painted 2 of the structures with the rusty metal primer, and then 3 in various shades of beige and off-white. With the structure placement figured out, it was time to work on the sidewalks and streets. I used evergreen scale model sidewalk styrene sheets for the main sidewalk area on the upper level. I cut the piece to serve as the sidewalk area and the structure base for the upper level and painted that with a light gray color, and also painted 2 more pieces of plain sheet styrene for concrete areas that were going to go underneath 2 of the lower tier structures. While those dried, I mixed up a couple of batches of Woodland Scenic Smooth It, to which I added some black India ink in order to kind of color it a darker gray color. I like doing that because this way if you do chip the road, you're not going to see white plaster, and it'll look pretty much the same color as a top surface. I poured that over the areas that I wanted paved and to look like asphalt, and then smoothed that out with a piece of sheet styrene. I didn't try to make it look perfectly smooth at this point since I was going to have to come back and sand it and add another coat anyway. Here you can see what the road looked like after being sanded, as well as what the upper level looks like with the sidewalk area glued down. I then mixed up another batch of Smooth It with the India ink and added and smoothed this next layer over all the paved areas to get things as level as I possibly could. And then after that was done, I came back later on and sanded it really smooth to get that final smooth surface. While that was drying, I painted the concrete retaining walls with some gray paint, and then I hit the corner structure and the retaining walls with a black wash once the paint was dry. I also used some Neo Lube on the turnout areas to kind of give those an oily look as well. Next, it was time to start some of the scenery texture work. I painted on some matte medium in the areas around the retaining walls and added some dirt, then a layer of ground foam, and finally a few pieces of Woodland Scenic's clump foliage here and there to kind of more or less finish up that little area there around the retaining walls. That was all then soaked with diluted matte medium again to make sure everything was very securely adhered to the layout and wouldn't come off when the layout was moved around. I did the same thing to a small hill area by the 2 turnouts. I originally had planned to put a small structure here, but decided to make it just a tree-covered hill instead. This area was covered with paint, dirt, ground foam, and then lots of glue. But before the glue dried, I actually added a layer of static grass as well, and then also by the retaining wall areas. I added some more Sculptamold to the right front corner of the layout, as well as between 2 of the tracks there on the right-hand side, just to kind of break up the terrain there and make it a little bit more interesting to look at. Next, while all that was drying, it was time to work on the structures once again. So for the long brick structure that goes on the back of the layout, I painted it with a light gray wash to simulate grout line. I dabbed off most of the paint that was on the tops of the bricks, and I tried to leave as much as I could in the grout lines. And I used the same wash on the other brick structures as well, and then let that dry. Even at this point, all the structures look really good, even without painting the windows or anything else, and you can really get a good idea here of how things are starting to look and come together on the layout. Now, for the most part, structures don't look quite as realistic when you don't have a roof on them, and so I went ahead and moved on to adding roofs to all the structures. A couple of the kits actually came with pre-sized pieces of styrene for the roofs, but the rest of them you had to do that yourself. They basically just provided you with a square of plain white styrene, and you had to cut that to size to fit the roof you had. And so to do that, I just basically placed the structure on top of the piece of styrene, traced it with a pencil, and then cut it out to size. And then I used strips of square styrene that came with the kits to act as little shelves along the inside top part of the structure, to which I could place and glue the larger, flat sheet of styrene that makes up the roof itself. Now, usually I don't do a great job cutting the roof sections. I have to usually fill in along the edges of the roof gap. We can use some plastic filler. Sometimes I just use a little bit of wood glue with some dirt mixed into it to kind of just fill in that gap. And then when I come back and paint it, you can't really tell that it's there. Next, I needed to finish painting the actual structure walls themselves. Usually I tend to do the minimal amount of painting that is needed. So for this structure here, I painted the non-brick areas a dark green. Then for the windows, I used a thin gray paint that was basically the same color that I used for the grout color. And this way, if some of that bled in between the bricks, you really wouldn't notice it. With a small brush and thin paint, you can actually usually get the paint to flow right along the window frame pretty easily without too much trouble. I chose not to paint the windowsill since there was a higher chance I was going to goof that up. And in general, it is better to not paint something than to paint it poorly. And so people will usually overlook details that aren't really painted or not applied, but will quickly notice ones that are done poorly. Also, try to avoid using bright colors. Use gray instead of white, for example. And if you keep the contrast between the colors lower, then your mistakes really won't be nearly as noticeable. For the long industry building, I just painted all the doors and didn't even bother with the window frames at all, since there were a lot of windows and it really wasn't going to be that noticeable anyway. I did cut out, though, 2 of the existing loading doors since I didn't like how they looked, and then I just glued on some gray styrene to the back of the opening to kind of simulate loading doors. Now, roofs do need a lot of details, and so I worked on the roofs for quite a while. I added some of the chimneys that were included in the kits, then added some other random square bits of plastic and such to look like mechanicals on the roof. And I did have to paint the chimneys as well, and then I painted the pipes and the details kind of just a plain gray color. Even though I planned to do gravel roofs on some of the structures, I went ahead and painted everything black, or actually a dark gray, so if any of it did show through, it wouldn't be that plain white styrene. Now, I really hate adding window glazing to structures more than anything else when I'm building a building kit, and so I had to tackle that at some point here, and so I went ahead and got that done before finishing up the roof details. And this way I could actually glue the structures onto the layout itself. So I did my best to glue in the glazing without getting any glue showing through in the window openings, and then I added various view blocks to the building interiors using either black construction paper or just some pieces of styrene so you couldn't see all the way straight through the structure. Before I returned to working on more roof details, I took a break and worked on scenery for a while. Again, I did some more ballasting, added some more ground cover and static grass to one end of the layout that I hadn't worked on yet, and just a few other scenery details. I figured at this point I probably should get the wiring done before installing the structures, otherwise I'd probably flip the layout over and crush all the structures right after I had finished building them. And so I drilled a hole through the side and bottom of the layout where I wanted all the wires to kind of feed through, then worked on soldering the track power leads together and running those up to that hole. And since I didn't plan to wire up the turnout controls, I just drilled a large hole in the bottom and bundled up those wires and kind of stuffed them in there, and then that later got covered up. This way, if you wanted to, you could pull those wires out and attach them to, toggle switches or whatever. But again, being right at the edge of the layout on a very tiny layout, there really wasn't much point in putting a separate switch to control the turnout that was sitting there right at the edge of the layout. I also needed to add a push-button control to the front of the layout to allow for easy operation by people that were viewing the layout. This way, they could push the button and the train would start running to make it very easy to operate. So I wired up the push-button switch and ran that wire back to the other end of the layout as well. And I taped all the wires to position temporarily and then kind of just hot glued everything in. And then later put some chipboard over these areas to cover up all the wires and kind of keep them secure. With most of the wiring done, I glued the structures onto the layout. I simply used a combination of wood glue and styrene cement to glue the structures to the layout, depending on whether they were being glued to the foam or being glued to the styrene base areas. And by the way, that Plastruct bonding will melt through foam insulation board with frightening speed, so you really, really don't want to spill that on a layout with foam insulation board. You can trust me on that one. So once everything was glued down, I weighted all the structures down and let them dry overnight before doing anything else to make sure they were good and secure and I wouldn't, accidentally knock them out of place. So trees were next, and since I did a video on how to build these super tree kits, I won't go into full detail here, but we'll just give you the quick summary. So the super tree material is also called seafoam and other things. It has a very realistic branch structure, and so you do really just have to paint it, apply glue, and then you can pretty much be ready to go to flock it and put it on the layout. So what I did was I took a flat camouflage brown color, which is not really a perfectly accurate bark color, but it does look close enough, and it's what I had on hand, so I just went ahead and used that to paint all of the armatures. And then once that paint was good and dry, I soaked everything in a diluted matte medium mix. I think it's like a 6 or 7 to 1 ratio of matte medium to water. Let them soak in there for a few minutes, and that provides not just glue for adding the flocking material, but also kind of helps soak into the tree armature itself. It makes it a little bit more flexible and keeps it from becoming quite as brittle and dry over time. And so once I pull the trees out, basically it's just a matter of adding various shades of texture and flocking to the trees. I even added some leaf flake material, which looks like very small, tiny leaves, and that really helps make the trees look very realistic. And then after flocking, you need to spray them down with more diluted matte medium and let them dry thoroughly overnight to make sure everything is really well secured. And the installation is very simple. All you have to do is poke a small hole in your scenery, put some glue on the stem, put it in the hole, and you're pretty much ready to go. And you can really see what a difference having realistic looking trees makes to a layout. So I jumped a bit ahead here as I hadn't actually finished all the ground cover prior to making and installing some of these trees. And so I needed to go ahead and finish that up in the same way I did on the other portions of the layout, as well as finishing up the rest of the ballasting, which I hadn't finished up yet either. I also did a video recently on the Woodland Scenics fence kits, and I installed those on the upper retaining wall area of the layout, and those fence kits are really easy to work with. They give you a very realistic looking fence in a hurry. They're just already pre-built. You just have to basically poke holes for the posts and stick them in there and glue them, and you're really good to go. So really easy to work with. The posts are a little bit oversized for inch scale, actually quite a bit oversized, but for the most part, really, unless you have like a figure there or something that's really going to tell you how oversized it is, and especially if you have it turned around backwards, you really don't notice it very much, and it still looks pretty good. Anyway, I finished installing the trees and also used an upside down roof vent as a small pot to create a potted tree on the sidewalk area of the upper level. I just sanded the top, or what really was now the bottom of the pot, flat, and then added some glue and dirt into the opening, stuck in a small tree along with a bit of clump foliage, and made a nice looking potted tree. With most of the scenery work done, it was time to get back to working on more of the roof details, and I used a Walther's Cornerstone kit here for all the roof details. You get a nice selection of vents, blowers, AC units, and other stuff to help make your roofs look a lot more realistic. But those details do not come pre-assembled, and I was kind of sad to find that out, but they do assemble pretty easily. There are a lot of small parts, so you just need to take your time, and everything will assemble very easily. Now, to actually paint these parts, I taped some blue painter's tape onto some cardboard, sticky side up, which allowed me to stick all the detail parts onto the tape so I could spray paint them without having them blow away. I sprayed all the detail parts with a gray hobby spray paint, and then when that was good and dry, I squeezed out a bit of burnt umber artist oil onto the cardboard. And then using a small piece of sponge off an old foam brush, I dipped the sponge into the paint, removed the excess, and then dabbed the sponge all around the edges and tops of the detail parts to give the appearance of rust. This is a really fast and easy way to give the appearance of rust, and it really dramatically improves the appearance of the roof details. And then those details were all glued into various places on all the structure roofs to really provide a much better looking rooftop scenery look to the layout. Next, I spray painted some of the power poles and street lights that came in the Woodland Scenics building kit, a combination of camouflage brown and camouflage tan, as well as some of the palettes that came in the kit. These were all white metal castings and look really nice when they're painted, but you usually have to scrape off some of the flashing. There's kind of some rough edges on those castings, but once you do scrape them off and paint them, they do look really realistic. To install the poles on the layout, I just had to lay them out where I wanted them, trying to keep them pretty much evenly spaced. Then I used a small screwdriver, poked holes in the scenery where I wanted each pole, and secured the poles with a bit of super glue. Since the roof details were all in place, I moved on to adding gravel roofs to 4 of the structures. And gravel roofs are really just my way of cheating when I don't want to have to be as careful and perfect making the roofs, and it kind of hides all the roof imperfections, and it still looks pretty good. The Woodland Scenics kit also comes with a couple of ladders, and so I installed those on the sides of 2 of the structures to add a bit more detail as well. Since I made a spot to dock the controller onto the layout, I wanted to keep the wires that extended from the back of the layout to the controller nice and neat. And so I saw that I had a pile of Allen wrenches that were all the same size that I had accumulated over time, And so I decided to use a couple of those here. I drilled holes for the Allen wrenches to fit into and then glued them in place with the short arms facing away from each other, which provided a nice set of posts that you could wrap the wires around and keep them nice and neat and out of the way. I also have a toggle switch on the back of the layout that connects to the button on the front. So if you throw the toggle switch one way, you need to push the button to run the layout. And if you have it thrown the other way, you don't use the push button at all. You can just control it as regular with the actual control box. But unfortunately, I had actually glued up the button on the front of the layout because when I was adding ballast and everything and soaking everything with matte medium, some of that ran down into the button, gummed it up, and so I had to go ahead and replace that. Next, to cover the exposed wires on the bottom of the layout, I glued on some pieces of chipboard and then added some screws to kind of really make sure everything was nice and secure. Then I painted the bottom and sides of the layout black and stuck on some self-adhesive felt feet to the bottom. And once all that was dry, I flipped everything over and painted the edges of the layout as well as the one side that I hadn't yet painted. After that first coat of paint was dry, I lightly sanded everything and applied a second coat of paint to ensure a nice smooth finish. And then once that was dry, I mixed up some matte medium and gloss medium, about 2 parts matte medium to 1 part gloss medium to produce a sort of a satin finish, and then I painted that over the black paint to help provide some protection to the paint surface. And then I glued on some vehicles and other detailed parts I had on hand to help finish up the layout and wrap things up. And so there you go, a really nice, small, portable, only 17 by 30 inch layout. Certainly small enough for any apartment, dorm, office desk, or even something to take with you in an RV. So very small, very portable, still fun to operate. So I really hope you enjoyed the build video of this project layout, and please consider hitting that like button if you enjoyed the video, and subscribing if you haven't already. I have several more layout projects coming up, as well as a bridge diorama project I'm working on, and so watch for those as well coming up here in the next few months. And so that's all for now, and thanks for watching. Bye.